Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our second speaker for this session, Dr. Simon Nathan, addressing us from Wellington. Welcome back, Simon. Dr. Simon Nathan is a graduate in geology from Canterbury University, where he regularly heard about Haast's pioneering work in many different fields, ranging from glaciation to volcanology. He worked for the New Zealand Geological Survey for over 30 years and was involved with geological mapping in different parts of the country. He was awarded a Doctor of Science degree for his publications and maps. He has always been interested in writing and historical research and was appointed science editor for Te Ara, the online encyclopedia of New Zealand. He has written several biographies, including that of James Hector, a contemporary and rival of Julius Haast. In recent years, he's become interested in the use of historical photographs, which we saw presented in the earlier paper today. This morning, Simon will be sharing his insights into the genesis and creation of the largest single-volume biography ever published in New Zealand, with the title of The Life and Times of Sir Julius von Haast, Explorer, Geologist, Museum Builder, published in 1948. Please welcome Dr. Simon Nathan.
Thank you, Kasia. Welcome, everyone. The Life and Times of Sir Julius von Haast is a monumental biography in every sense. Researched and written by his son Heinrich von Haast and published in 1948, it weighs 1.8 kilograms and contains 1,142 pages of text, as well as photographic plates and several folding maps. It is one of the largest New Zealand books ever published. My first sight of the biography was as a schoolboy in the late 1950s, when surplus copies were being sold off at Whitcomb and Tombs' annual sale in Christchurch. It was a bargain for 5 shillings, then 50 cents in today's money, but after picking it up, I realised that it was too unwieldy to carry home on my bike. It was a decision I have often regretted, as the copy shown on the screen cost me a lot more when I bought it many years later. My next interaction with the book was about 15 years ago, when I was thinking about writing a biography of Haast's contemporary, James Hector. I looked at the Haast biography and was immediately discouraged. It has cast a long shadow over anyone attempting to write a biography of a New Zealand scientist. I had no wish to spend the years needed to research and write such an enormous book. But discussion with fellow writers was helpful, as it was pointed out to me that while the Haast book was respected as a reference volume, it is difficult to find anyone who's actually read it. I resolved to aim at a book that was readable, and that the final published Hector biography is only about a quarter the size of the Haast volume. In this talk, I want to summarise the events leading to the publication of this major biography and to comment on how it is viewed in the 21st century. But first, I need to say something about the author, Heinrich von Haast, and the intellectual climate in which he was working. Born in 1864, Heinrich was the oldest child of Julius and Mary von Haast. Julius was over 40 when he was born, so Heinrich knew little of his father's German background or his early explorations in Nelson or Canterbury. As a teenager, Heinrich accompanied his father on some field trips, but decided that he had no wish to follow a scientific career. On leaving school, he got a job as a junior clerk. Then winning scholarships allowed him to attend university, where he studied law. When Julius was given 18 months' leave in 1885 to become commissioner at the Calendaries exhibition in London, he arranged for Heinrich to fill his position as acting director of the Canterbury Museum. It was a big responsibility for a 21-year-old, but Julius maintained control from a distance through a stream of letters. When his father died suddenly in 1887, a few weeks after returning from his overseas trip, Heinrich offered his services to the museum board, but discovered that they had already offered the position to someone else without contacting or consulting him. This undoubtedly contributed to his antipathy to the museum administration in later years. Heinrich had a long career, starting in Christchurch, moving to London, and then to Australia, before returning to New Zealand in 1903 to set up his own legal practice in Wellington. He lectured in law at Victoria University College and was a senior member of the New Zealand Law Society. In later years, he had considerable involvement in public affairs, including serving on the Senate of the University of New Zealand. Although he had spent many years attempting to escape from the shadow of his famous father, Heinrich gradually became interested in family history. When he turned 70 in 1934, he decided to retire from his law practice. Historian and writer James Cowan persuaded him that a biography of his father was needed and that he was the one to write it. The original intention was to have it published for the New Zealand Centennial celebrations in 1940. I believe that a secondary aim in the back of Heinrich's mind was to restore his father's reputation. When Julius died unexpectedly in 1887, he was lauded for his pioneering scientific work as well as the establishment of the Canterbury Museum. But as the years passed, his reputation declined. He had always been an unusual and controversial personality in Anglophile Canterbury, with detractors as well as supporters. There was strong anti-German feeling during and after World War I, and he was quietly overlooked. It is to the credit of the museum authorities that his name was not erased, as happened to others of German descent. Active criticism came from a different quarter. In the 1920s and 1930s, a group of young men, mainly associated with the Canterbury Mountaineering Club, started exploring the mountainous country of Canterbury, tackling previously unclimbed peaks. In many places, the best maps available date back to Haast's exploration in the early 1860s, and some of the younger generation were critical. Haast himself was never interested in climbing, and there were debates about the identification of some of the peaks shown on his maps. He normally worked with assistants, with supplies being carried by pack horses, and this luxury was derided by the younger generation, who carried all their supplies in heavy packs. Writer John Pascoe was an active member of the Canterbury Mountaineering Club and wrote several articles from the Making New Zealand series, a series of booklets celebrating the 1940 centennial. In one article, he denigrated Haast's exploration in Canterbury and commented that he had sprinkled German names liberally all over the landscape. These guttural legacies survive on the map to this day. Heinrich was incensed and wrote a letter listing all the errors and omissions in Pascoe's account. This and the associated correspondence, now held in the Alexander Turnbull Library, illustrate the way that Haast had become viewed by some in the mountaineering fraternity. When he settled down to plan the biography project, Heinrich realised that he had little detailed information on his father's life. Despite growing up in close proximity, he had shown little interest in his father's enthusiasms and overseas connections. As a teenager, Heinrich's passion was football. He captained his university team from 1886 to 88, and Julius disdained sport. Heinrich started by preparing a detailed chronology of his father's life, based on months of scanning the newspapers held in the basement of the Parliamentary Library, and then expanded his search to cover records of the Canterbury Provincial Council, Canterbury Philosophical Institute, and Canterbury University College, as well as published papers and reports written by his father. In going through Heinrich's account of the work he did, it's a reminder of how much easier historical research is in the 21st century, when so much historical material is digitized. Heinrich had to search for everything and take notes in longhand on what he found. When Julius died, almost 50 years earlier, Mary von Haast had packed up and stored all his papers and correspondence in 2 tin boxes, and this formed an additional and unique research resource. Heinrich found that he had a mountain of research material, and searching and cataloguing it all took several years. He planned the book to be a largely chronological account of his father's life and activities. The published book contains 72 chapters, of which about 60 cover relatively short periods or events, interspersed with chapters on more general topics. These general chapters provide an interesting background about life in Canterbury in the late 19th century, both the settlers and the small scientific community. Heinrich himself had attended Christ's College and was well connected with the sons of many of the leading families. The biography is really a story of Julius Haast's years in Christchurch, from his arrival in 1860 until his death in 1887. The first half of his life, before he reached New Zealand, is covered very briefly in the first 7 pages of chapter 1. Heinrich had little material to work on, except for family legend and obituaries, and his attempts to gather more information from Germany was largely unsuccessful. The description of the early work that Julius undertook with Hochstetter and subsequent exploration of Nelson in 1859-60 is essentially a paraphrase of previously published accounts. Heinrich's work on the biography took over a decade, far longer than originally intended. He was thorough and painstaking in his research. In writing each chronological chapter, he appears to have gathered every bit of information relating to the time period being covered and written it up as a connected story. The chapters are generally not terribly long, only about 10 to 20 pages, but very detailed. The writing is clear with simple language. Heinrich had skill at synthesizing information, probably reflecting his experience preparing legal briefs, but he did not summarize. If he found an interesting detail, it is always included. For example, if you want to know why the spelling of the name of the Franz Joseph Glacier, named by Julius, is different from the way the emperor spelled his name, you will find an explanation in footnote 8 on page 393. By my estimation, Heinrich probably took about a month or so working on each chapter. As he worked onwards, the manuscript grew progressively larger. Not having produced a book previously, nor having any editorial oversight, I suspect that he had little idea how large it was becoming. The text is enlivened by personal memories of family life. Heinrich is not uncritical of his father. He mentions his impetuosity and quick temper as failings that often caused problems and antagonized those he was dealing with. With wry humor, he relates the attempts that his father made to obtain recognition and honors through his overseas contacts. Julius was a gambler, but gave Mary, his future wife, a promise that he would not play for money after his marriage. Over the years, he invested in various business adventures, including land, flax, and sheep, all of which lost money. And when he died, he had a very small estate. As the oldest son, Heinrich probably had to deal with the consequences of his mother being left a widow with very little income. Throughout the book, there are comments on Julius's friends, colleagues, and contemporaries. His outspoken comments sometimes made enemies, but Heinrich has tried to be fair to most of those mentioned. From my own research, I'm aware of the rivalry bubbling under the surface with James Hector. But Heinrich's assessment is generous to Hector, who was often exasperated by Julius Haast and resented the success of his museum. Heinrich decided to include 4 folded maps that had previously been prepared by Haast but were not easily available. I have included parts of 2 of them on the slide you can see. The map on the left shows the extent of topographic mapping around 1860, when Haast arrived in Canterbury. All the flatter land near this coast had been surveyed and subdivided for farming, but the steeper hill country and alpine regions were almost a blank. The map on the right, drawn up for the Royal Geographical Society in 1870, shows the progress in mapping the region a decade later, illustrating the complexity and steepness of the higher topography that Haast was covering. Completing the map of the most rugged part of New Zealand was an impressive undertaking. and illustrates the unfairness of much of the criticism that came from the mountaineering fraternity. Although the text of the book is predominantly narrative, Heinrich devotes space to some topics that he feels require more explanation. For example, chapter 24, Discovery of the Haast Pass, is followed by chapter 25, Charles Cameron's claim to have discovered the Haast Pass. The facts are laid out in detail, but the commentary makes it clear that Heinrich is acting as his father's advocate by discounting the claims made that Cameron had been over the pass before Haast and his party arrived. The last chronological chapter, chapter 67, deals with Haast's death and burial in 1887. It is followed by 4 chapters that deals with Haast's major achievements. Chapter 69, with the title Haast Nomenclature, deals with the names that Haast had applied to geographical features in Nelson and Canterbury. One of the longest chapters, it is undoubtedly a response to Pascoe's jibe about the prevalence of German names given by Julius Haast. Heinrich lists the names as far as he was able to do so. Scrutiny of the list shows the falsity of Pascoe's claim, as the majority of names are either of British scientists or prominent Cantabrians. There is little information on events leading to the publication of the biography. It appears that Heinrich had discussions with a number of publishers without getting a positive response. During and after World War I, there was a paper shortage and few books were published in New Zealand. Potential publishers were probably doubtful about the likely sales of a book about a German scientist, and the manuscript was enormous. The negative response led Heinrich to decide to take the financial risk of funding publication himself and to sell copies by subscription. Avery Press in New Plymouth was contracted to undertake the project and did an excellent job of printing and binding the large volume. Heinrich prepared a flyer advertising the new book and distributed widely around New Zealand and overseas. He set a price of 3 guineas, including postage on the book, equivalent to $260 New Zealand in 2022 values. It was published in 1948. A steady trickle of orders came in, and Heinrich and Mary Haast regularly packed parcels and dispatched them from the local post office. By 1949, when Heinrich addressed the New Plymouth Rotary Club about his biography project, he reported that he had already covered the cost of printing and was starting to make a small profit. Heinrich was friendly with Johannes Andersen, the first librarian of the Alexander Turnbull Library, and decided to deposit his research papers there, rather than at Canterbury Museum, which he felt had failed to honour his father. After Heinrich's death in 1953, all the remaining papers of both Julius and Heinrich von Haast were handed over by Heinrich's widow and formed the Haast family collection. The records of Julius von Haast have recently been added to the UNESCO Memory of the World Register as a key collection of records relating to 19th century New Zealand science. Heinrich sent copies of the book to publishers both locally and overseas. The reaction from reviewers was generally positive. Few biographies of New Zealand pioneers had previously been published, and it was recognised that this was an important contribution both to the history of science and to the settlement of the Canterbury region. He also submitted it to the University of New Zealand and was awarded a Doctor of Literature degree. The one discordant note was from John Pascoe, who reviewed it from the press in Christchurch. While acknowledging that the research was impressive and the factual basis could hardly be faulted, he commented that Mr. von Haast tends to write too steadily as his father's advocate, filially attaching to his cause. A measure of judicial detachment was needed and would have been worth the struggle. Later writers have tended to agree with Pascoe, and some have called the book a hagiography. I believe that this label is inappropriate. It is generally applied to biographies where any negative information is omitted or glossed over in order to enhance the reputation of the subject. This is certainly not the case in this book, where the problem is information overload and nothing is left out. Viewed from a 21st century perspective, the biography has some defects. Heinrich grew up in the later part of the 19th century, and he has produced a Victorian biography. It is far too long and suffers from a lack of editorial supervision. The issue of bias is open to debate. Almost all biographies are written because the author wants to tell the story of the subject. In my judgment, it is a generally fair and exhaustive assessment of Julius Haast, but in a few places, Heinrich gets carried away and, having presented the facts, starts to act as counsel for the defence. Yet the fact remains that 75 years after its publication, no one else has written another biography of Haast, nor are they likely to try, because there is little new to be said. Recent theses and newly published collections of letters have added information, but not made much change to the overall story. Heinrich von Haast's monument still stands as the definitive biography of Julius von Haast. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. You are likely one of the few people to have read this book cover to cover. As you mentioned, it is an invaluable source of reference. I've really enjoyed hearing about this background to the writing and research of this biography, which still stands largely, as you say, unchallenged as the primary source on the life and times of Sir Julius von Haast. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us today.